So let me read now a selection where I talk about Elisa's last days in Russia. Elisa's impending departure made the entire family tense. At each bureaucratic hurdle, Elisa was struck with panic attacks at the prospect she might not escape. Even as they urged her to use any means necessary to stay in the United States, the Rosenbaums were devastated by her departure. Elisa appeared more sanguine. Going to America was like, quote, going to Mars, end quote, and she knew she might never see her family again. Yet she was supremely confident about her own prospects, and she also shared her father's sense that the communist government could not last. Quote, I'll be famous by the time I return, close quote, she shouted to her stricken family as the train pulled out of the Leningrad station in January 1926. Aside from the lovelorn Seryoza, who would accompany her as far as Moscow, Elisa was on her own. She carried with her 17 film scenarios and a precious stone sewn into her clothes by Anna. Nora, Natasha, and her cousins chased after the train as it faded into the distance. Zinovy returned home and wept. Leaving Russia was only the first step, for Elisa still had to receive immigration papers from the American consulate in neighboring Latvia. Just a year earlier, responding to rising nativist sentiment, the U.S. Congress had moved to severely restrict immigration from Russia and other Eastern European countries. As she waited for her appointment, staying with family friends, Elisa soothed her nerves at the cinema, seeing 4 films during her brief stay. A quick fib about a fiancé secured her the necessary American papers, and then she was off, taking a train through Berlin and Paris, where more family connections smoothed her way. At The Hague, she sent a last cable to Leningrad, and then took passage on an ocean liner bound for New York. Once there, she would be met by yet more family friends who would shepherd her to Chicago. On board the de Grasse, Elisa was flattened by seasickness. But as she lay pinned to her berth by the motion of the sea, she began refashioning herself. In Russia, she had experimented with using a different surname, Rand, an abbreviation of Rosenbaum. Now she jettisoned Elisa for a given name inspired by a Finnish writer. Like a Hollywood star, she wanted a new, streamlined name that would be memorable on the marquee. The one she ultimately chose, Ayn Rand, freed her from her gender, her religion, her past. It was the perfect name for a child of destiny. Now, the tale from there is extraordinary. I'll fast forward through most of it. She goes from New York to Chicago and then on to Hollywood. On her first day in Hollywood, she has a chance encounter with the famous director Cecil B. DeMille, talks him into giving her a job, begins working as a screenwriter, marries a dashing young actor named Frank O'Connor, and continues to write. She writes screenplays, a play that's eventually successful, an early novel, and achieves lasting fame with The Fountainhead in 1943. And The Fountainhead is really what made her into an icon of the right for its attack upon collectivism and its celebration of the individual. And though The Fountainhead is generally understood or received as a story about an independent architect who refuses to compromise his ideas or his designs for popularity, it also can be read as a parable about the dangers of expanding government and Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal. During the time she wrote the book, took her 12 years to complete, Ayn Rand became politically active and politically aware and identified herself as an opponent of Franklin Roosevelt, and in fact worked for the presidential campaign of Wendell Willkie, Roosevelt's opponent in the 1940 election. And so in my book, I describe how this transformation shaped the way she developed the novel and how you can understand it as a political piece of writing as well as an artistic tale. And so it was this book that a first generation of conservatives really seized upon and looked to Rand as a figurehead and as a leader. But there was always a tension here right from the beginning because of Rand's atheism. which I mentioned before. And so I'm going to fast forward now to the early 1950s and read you a scene when she first encounters William F. Buckley, Jr., the most famous conservative of his day and perhaps of our day still. In the years since the Fountainhead, religion had moved to the forefront of American political discourse. Rand remembered the transition clearly. Until the mid to late 1940s, she, quote, did not take the issue of religion and politics very seriously because there was no such threat. The conservatives did not tie their side to God. There was no serious attempt to proclaim that if you wanted to be conservative or to support capitalism, you had to base your case on faith. By 1950, all this was changing. As the Cold War closed in, communism became always and everywhere godless, and capitalism became linked to Christianity. William F. Buckley's best-selling debut, God and Man at Yale, famously recast Rand and Hayek's secular individualism versus collectivism as an essentially religious struggle, arguing that it replicated on another level the, quote, duel between Christianity and atheism, end quote. 2 years later, in his iconic autobiography, Witness, Whittaker Chambers defined communism as, quote, man without God, close quote, a substitute faith that flourished in the absence of traditional religion. Russell Kirk kicked off a vogue for new conservatism with his 1953 book, The Conservative Mind, which asserted the importance of religious traditionalism. Even on the left, intellectuals gravitated toward the neo-orthodox theology of the former socialist Reinhold Niebuhr. In turn, Rand became an ever more devoted atheist. At a cocktail party, she met the young Buckley, already a celebrated figure on the right. She was characteristically direct, telling him in her thick Russian accent, "You are too intelligent to believe in God." Or as Buckley remembered it, Gott. Buckley was both amused and offended. He sought the advice of other libertarians, including Isabel Patterson, as he pulled together National Review, the flagship magazine of American conservatism. But Rand became one of his favorite targets. And indeed, the feud between Buckley and Rand would go on for decades after this, as sort of a recurring theme in her career. And although they weren't particularly fond of each other, Rand wasn't too hung up on Buckley's opinion of her because she had other powerful admirers, among them, most famously, a young Alan Greenspan.